newsletter that just buries you in all the latest and greatest from the Libertarian front in news articles and opinion. But this was written in 2007, December 11th. The Honor of Being Human. Why do you support? And he wrote, I offer here the first of several essays that will focus on general questions connecting to a number of earlier articles as well as to certain upcoming pieces. The initial issue that requires further clarification is one I am addressing in considerable detail. The question of obedience. Obedience is a central theme in my continuing Final Descent series, in part because of my own thinking about this issue, and in part because of some unusually perceptive and provocative emails I've received. I offer the following descriptive definition of what I mean by, quote, obedience. It may seem to certain readers that I offer this informal definition rather late in the game, since I have been analyzing many issues related to obedience for several years. But in this, I follow a common pattern. It is only after we consider a generally understood phenomenon in many different manifestations that we can begin to isolate the critical underlying features. Even now, I am not entirely satisfied with this description, but it will suffice for the moment. I will undoubtedly have occasion to revisit this description and to refine it as my own understanding increases. I describe obedience in the following manner for a variety of complicated reasons, which reasons alone would require several lengthy essays to explain. Most importantly, for my immediate purposes, I wanted this description to encompass at least three fundamentally different kinds of relationships, but to isolate the dynamics of obedience that are common to all of them. Those three relationships are parent to child, one adult to another adult, and the adult to the state. Here is the description I've come up with.
And I can give you a narrator voice that says, obedience is the term used to describe the demand by a person in a superior position, superior psychologically, legally, and or in terms of the power he possesses in some other form, that a person in an inferior position conduct himself in a particular manner. The essence of obedience is the demand without more. A reason may be provided, but a reason is unnecessary. Moreover, the reason may be unconvincing or incoherent, and it may contradict other reasons provided for other demands. Most importantly, the reason need not be one that the person in the inferior position agrees with. Informed voluntary agreement occurs when a person is presented with a reason or reasons to act in a certain manner. He understands and is ultimately convinced of the validity of the reasons and therefore acts in the manner suggested.
So, Paul, just to interject here, do you think because I said so is a valid reason?
Not to me, but because I said so and somebody pointing a gun, yeah, that would convince me in the short term, but valid? No.
Doesn't really make it valid or convincing.
No, that would convince me that I probably would obey them in the short term, but convincing, valid? No. Legitimate? No.
What about because the law says so? That's kind of the same as saying because I said so.
That's just a guy with a gun, isn't it?
Pretty much is, because the law is, who makes the laws? Human beings, right?
Yeah, and who enforces them? Guys with guns, huh?
Mm-hmm. And what's their jurisdiction to make rules on property that they do not own?
Oh, I know. There's this paper. It's called the Constitution. No? Oh, okay, maybe not.
Yeah.
Anyway, obedience is the opposite of voluntary, uncoerced agreement. The understanding and agreement of the person in the inferior position are not required and are often not sought at all. The person in the inferior position may profoundly disagree with the reason or reasons offered for the demand, if any. When the person in the inferior position obeys, he or she does so because of their certain knowledge that if they do not, he or she will be punished in some form, psychologically, legally, socially, or in some other way. Thus, the primary, although not the sole, motivation that ensures obedience is negative in nature. It is not the promise of a reward, even though certain rewards may be offered, but the assurance that he or she will not suffer consequences that are painful in varying degrees. That is, that he will not be punished.
Mm-hmm. That's a pretty thorough definition or analysis of it, isn't it?
That works for me.
Mm-hmm. And he wrote, I have discussed the centrality of obedience to the way in which almost all children are raised in my numerous essays based on Alice Miller's work, as well as in the Final Descent series, and also in one of my articles about the high school students who protested the Iraq occupation, When Awareness is a Crime, and other lessons from Morton West.
Yes, I think listeners to this podcast, can go back and hear Wes and his co-host talking about Alice Miller's work in more detail.
And the issue of obedience, we have touched on it too when Daniel has been on the show, Daniel Lachemacher of warisimmoral.com. I think that is a concept that is widely misunderstood in the military community, for one, don't you think?
Oh, yeah, and I can only have the greatest admiration for him in the standpoint that he really took disobedience to heart when he tells his superiors in the military that he will not obey. That takes a lot of balls.
Yeah, because obedience is seen as virtuous, in the military especially. And I guess in child-parent relationships, he gets into these different dynamics, of course, here. He says it must be appreciated that the child is in a unique position, one that is uniquely defenseless and dependent. As I often note, the child literally depends on his primary caregiver or caregivers for everything, including life itself. Because of this dependency inherent in the child's status, especially that of a very young one, the child has no choice but to obey. If he does not, he fears the withdrawal of the caregiver's affection and protection, which might ultimately mean the loss of the child's life. Although the child may not understand this in explicit terms, he feels the certainty of this knowledge very deeply. I will soon be examining in more detail the frequently tragic and destructive results of these factors, which place the child at grave risk of abuse, which can be psychological and or physical in nature.
Yeah, it can be said that the larger the disparity of power between any two people invites the chance for abuse, and that person in a superior position has a tremendous moral responsibility to act sanely, rationally, and morally towards the person who is in their charge.
It's interesting because a lot of libertarians look at the nature of government not having free market checks on it, right? It is basically absolute power because it's a coercive, legalized monopoly over a certain geographical territory. And it's might makes right, majority rules, it's collectivized abstractions. Essentially, it's communistic.
Yeah, I like that when they talk about, well, no, we've got checks and balances. Yeah, right. One gang member is going to check another gang member.
Mm-hmm. Well, you can always vote, Paul. That's the thing. You can vote for your rulers. You can choose who is going to rule you, who's going to represent you.
Choose which gang member is going to jack me for my income. Oh, I got it. Yeah. That helps a lot.
It's not even the fact that you can choose who represents you, because you basically just throw your little ballot in a hat, and if you come up short along with the rest of the minority, then you're not going to get that person. You're going to have to abide by someone else's choice.
Yeah, that's true. Participating in that is an implicit agreement that you'll abide by and hold legitimate the decision that finally is announced. That's a scary thought.
Mm-hmm. And that's why politics is fundamentally immoral and unjust, because it involves no semblance of consent in that fashion.
And thereby can never bring about any sort of real liberty.
But we're told by statists all the time that if you don't like it, you can vote, and if you don't vote, you have no reason to complain, right?
Yeah, that's a great trap.
Mm-hmm. So what sort of checks, if you look at the parental system, the family system, it's essentially operating in a free market fashion, is it not?
Well, it depends. I mean, obviously the parents, in a free society, the parents will have other people in the culture to interact with, and if other people see them doing things unsavory, especially to their children, they certainly will be able to bring about either just social pressure and, if things get really out of hand, physical rescue to someone. Let's just take, for example, a child abuse situation. Right now, if you know of a child being abused, talking about severely beaten, we're talking about, some pretty nasty stuff. This hits the papers fairly frequently, that young girl that was kept a prisoner for years behind their house, and all these the so-called state social services people would come by, and they never bothered to look in the backyard, and CPS
is the typical go-to organization.